On Christmas Day, in the year 800, at Mass in St. Peter's Basilica at Rome, Charles, King of the Franks and Lombards, better known to us as Charles the Great or Charlemagne, was acclaimed emperor and crowned by the Pope. For the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, a ruler had emerged who was strong enough to unify Western Europe under a single scepter. In the course of his long reign, Charlemagne extended the kingdom he inherited until it stretched from the Elbe to the Ebro and from the North Sea to Rome. His imperial coronation by the Pope himself demonstrated that after 400 years of chaos, Europe was on the way to recovery. But Charlemagne was not concerned only with conquest and coronation. He also brought to his court the leading scholars and artists of his day, men who not only rescued much classical learning from oblivion, they passed it on to later generations, adding distinctive improvements of their own. Charlemagne died in 814. This much later medieval manuscript illustration shows his life being weighed in the balance at the gates of heaven, whilst the forces of evil wait greedily to snatch his soul away to hell. The unity established by Charlemagne was soon shattered. Under his descendants, the empire disintegrated. Kingdoms rose and fell, with a clear distinction gradually emerging between the lands in the east that became Germany and the lands in the west that became France. Both kingdoms suffered severe losses, not only from each other, but at the hands of the raiders from the north, well organized and well armed, the Vikings. These warlike peoples emerged from Scandinavia, mainly raiding by sea, but then acquiring land bases, fighting, often from horseback, conquering, and in some areas, such as eastern England, making permanent settlements. The Viking raids on eastern England began towards the end of the 8th century, although it was well over 100 years later that they're believed to have come ashore here at Flamborough Head in East Yorkshire. This small gully in the chalk cliff at Flamborough was the scene of their successful invasion. It's still known as Dane's Dyke. Much earlier, in 793, a fleet of Viking longships landed on the island of Lindisfarne, just off the coast of Northumberland, where the early Christians had established one of the first monasteries, and where the Lindisfarne Gospels were produced around the year 700. The first monastery was destroyed by the attackers and replaced with this priory, built by the Normans in the 11th century. The first abbey at Whitby in North Yorkshire was founded in 657 by St. Hilda, on land given by Oswy, King of Northumbria. The Vikings destroyed the abbey in a series of raids on eastern England. Its Norman replacement, too, has gone. The ruin that stands today dates from the 13th century. In the south, Muslims from North Africa attacked southern Italy, Sardinia, southern France, and northern Spain. They raided what little shipping there was in the western Mediterranean, and in the late 9th and 10th centuries wrested substantial areas of southern Europe from Christian hands. Finally, in the late 9th century, the Magyars from Central Asia launched destructive raids which penetrated deep into Western Europe. The Vikings, the Muslims, and the Magyars. For more than a century, the lands of Latin Christendom were a citadel under siege. Eventually, the Vikings settled. The Muslims were kept at bay, and in the year 955, Otto I, King of Germany, won a crushing defeat over the Magyars at the river Lech. Central Europe was at last able to enjoy a more secure and peaceful future. In 962 at Rome, the victorious Otto was crowned Emperor of the West, successor to Charlemagne. This magnificent bejeweled crown used at his coronation has survived unscathed throughout the centuries. Meanwhile, in the East, the Byzantine Empire, too, was recovering from a long period of weakness, brought on by bitter religious divisions. Lands previously lost to Islam were reconquered, and by the second half of the 9th century, the Greek Orthodox Church was gaining converts in southeastern Europe. Saint Cyril and Methodius were the first of many missionaries whose allegiance was to Orthodox rather than to Roman Christianity. They converted the Slavs and other peoples, and within 100 years, Kievan Russia was converted to Christianity by the missionaries from Constantinople. That Orthodox Christianity still flourishes in many parts of Russia today. There can be few people in the West who would fail to be surprised by these scenes of the celebration of Easter in the crowded church at Zagorsk, north of Moscow. In fact, the monastery at Zagorsk is the seat of the Patriarch and the center of Russian Christianity. In much of Western Europe, authority remained fragmented. Powerful barons who had originally led armies and presided over courts of justice in their king's name now acknowledged only a distant allegiance to their monarch and passed on title and powers to a son or other descendant mostly without challenge. They and their families also controlled bishoprics and monasteries and regarded themselves as the owners of lesser churches. Some, like Duke William of Normandy, went on to conquer whole kingdoms which they held in their own right. Here, the Bayeux tapestries record his conquest of England in 1066. In most areas of Europe, lesser landowners, known as milites or knights, were also trying to extend their properties, maximize the return from them, and increase their power over those who cultivated them. Both nobles and knights used similar techniques, as in the 11th century, relative peace returned to Europe. Estates were consolidated and increased labor services or rents extracted. In many areas along the North Sea coasts and elsewhere, hundreds of square miles of previously waterlogged land were claimed for farming. Sometimes the work was done by peasants seeking new opportunities for themselves, but more often it was carried out by the agents of the landlord. Nevertheless, much of Europe long remained covered by forest, marsh, and sand dunes. Towns and cities were undergoing rapid expansion. At Cologne in Germany, 3 new circuits of walls were constructed in a century and a half, more than doubling its size. The overall picture is one of marked increase in the population, until a peak was reached about the year 1300. When Europe may have had 4 or 5 times as many inhabitants as 300 years before. Everywhere, the towns stood out as centers of population growth. In 1143, for example, a German count rebuilt Lübeck. He sent messengers to every country, says the chronicler Helmond, to invite anyone who was suffering from land hunger to come with his family to Lübeck. The result was that people flocked to the city from far and wide. Its subsequent prosperity is still reflected in its splendid late medieval merchants' houses. Towns made mutual treaties with each other to reduce conflict and ease access to one another's markets. The treaties were the basis of the Hanseatic League, under Lübeck's leadership. For a time, a complex network extended from Lübeck as far as London in the west and Novgorod in the east. The League treated on equal terms with the rulers of the lands through which the routes passed. As a result, it was able to supply the whole of Europe with timber, furs, fish, and grain. This illustration shows the busy harbor at Hamburg. In the south, the Mediterranean, which had for 3 centuries been almost an Arab lake, was being opened up by Italian seafarers. Arab bases on the islands were destroyed, along with their strongholds in North Africa. The merchants of Genoa sailed mainly along the coasts of France and Spain. From Pisa, traders journeyed south as far as the coast of Africa. Venetian ships sailed as far as Constantinople, Syria, and the Levant. The men of Amalfi followed similar routes to the Venetians and also traveled south. In addition, a network of land trade routes connected the northern Mediterranean with England and the Low Countries. The rapid growth of Mediterranean trade and the resulting expansion of the Italian port cities was followed by a remarkable expansion of Europe's territory beyond its old medieval frontiers. This was the crusading movement, and the Crusader states established in Palestine and Syria would rely on the Italian merchant fleets for transport and supplies. None of the Italian ports would make better use of these new opportunities than Venice. She was to expand her fleet until by the beginning of the 13th century she was indispensable to the Crusaders and invincible in Mediterranean naval power. The initial impetus for the Crusades came from the papacy. Since the days of Charlemagne, the Roman Church had fallen increasingly under the control of laymen. But in the early 11th century, a reform movement grew up which improved clerical standards and loosened the dependence of churchmen on their lay patrons. At first, the movement was led by the abbots and monks of convents like Cluny in Burgundy. Later, it spread to more distant religious houses, like Rievaulx Abbey, the first Cistercian monastery established in the north of England, and one of the most magnificent monastic ruins to be found anywhere in Britain. But well before the establishment of Rievaulx, in fact from the middle of the 11th century onwards, this reform movement won the active support of a succession of popes. The papacy was well placed to give direction to the crusading movement, when, in 1095, an appeal for aid arrived in the west from the beleaguered Byzantine Empire. The response of ordinary Christians in the west was remarkable and never to be repeated. Tens of thousands set out by land and sea for the Holy Land. Why? Many of those who heeded the call to take up the cross and recover the holy places in Palestine and Christendom seem to have done so from genuine motives of piety. Some of them sought forgiveness for their sins by helping to expel the infidel. Others, especially the humblest who went first, and mostly died on the way, confused the heavenly and the earthly Jerusalem they had heard about in sermons. But not all the Crusaders were moved by piety. Stephen, Count of Blois, took the cross to escape from a nagging wife, and when he found the siege of Antioch was even worse, he hurried back home. Bohemond, younger son of the ruler of Naples, took the cross specifically to carve out a principality for himself in the east, and he did so at Antioch. Together, these minor Western rulers and others like them gathered with their followers at Constantinople in 1096, swore an oath of allegiance to the Byzantine emperor, and set out to regain the lands lost to Islam. Aided by temporary disunity among the Muslim states opposing them, they recaptured Nicaea in 1097, Antioch in 1098, and in an orgy of bloodletting, Jerusalem in 1099. At once, the Crusaders, who by now numbered perhaps only 10,000, created states of their own at Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. To defend them, they built magnificent castles. One of the most impressive, Crac de Chevalier, still stands today in what is now Syria. As garrison troops, they employed mainly members of military orders which were specially formed to keep the Holy Land in Christian hands. This was the beginning of the Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar. The Crusader barons themselves lived ostentatiously in their coastal cities, such as Acre, relying upon the merchants from Italy to supply their needs. They became the colonial elite, isolated behind their massive fortifications both from the native population and from their peers in the West. This isolation contributed to the movement's eventual failure. For nearly 100 years, the Crusaders held on to their possessions in the Levant. But in the latter half of the 12th century, the Muslims surrounding them recovered their strength. Powerful leaders like Saladin of Egypt led them in a jihad, or holy war, against the Christian invaders. In 1187, less than a century after its recapture, the Christians lost Jerusalem. From this time forward, the Crusader states were doomed. A major reason for the failure was a lack of manpower. The journey to the Near East was a hazardous one at the best of times. Those who did arrive safely often became homesick and soon decided to return. Not all of them made it. The crusading knight, whose tomb is at Dorchester, Oxfordshire, was one of the lucky ones. Many died on the way. Others were captured by the Saracens, like Louis IX of France, pictured here before his departure with his smiling wife. Others simply got lost, like Count Hugh of Vaudemont. He began his return in 1249, but didn't reach home until 14 years later. Here his faithful wife embraces her exhausted husband, lean and haggard after his long ordeal. He died shortly after his homecoming. The Crusader movement was not confined to the lands of the Levant. In northeastern Europe, the Christian states in what is now Germany, Poland and Hungary were zealously conquering and converting their pagan neighbors further east. This movement was spearheaded by the Teutonic Knights, who came to control the lands on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea. The great Russian film director Sergei Eisenstein immortalized the Knights in his classic film Alexander Nevsky, made in 1938. This sequence shows the Knights attacking the Russian troops before the climactic battle on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus in 1242, at which the northward expansion of their lands was halted. Like the Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights observed a strict code of celibacy, as well as a rigorous discipline. But they earned a reputation for ruthlessness as well as for efficiency. They believed they would achieve salvation by self-sacrifice and by bringing others to Christ, if necessary, by force. It was a very different kind of crusade that the Italian Francis of Assisi was preaching early in the 13th century. His message of peace and compassion was a sharp contrast to the aggressive methods employed by the knights. Spreading the word of God on the point of a sword was not as incongruous then as it appears to us today. But by then, knighthood was both a way of life and an integral part of the institutional structure of all Western kingdoms. Its most visible expressions were the stone castles which became common all over Western Europe. Orford Castle in Suffolk was built in the 1170s. Only a few miles inland, the local landlord built this castle at Framlingham, as much for defense against his neighbors as to protect England from overseas attack. Further north, Bamborough Castle in Northumberland stands majestically above the North Sea on the site of the old capital of the kings of Northumbria. At first, the castles were built for defense, but increasingly they became family residences, or administrative centers, or both. But the knights and barons were not always passive vassals, blindly strengthening the authority of their king at the expense of their own traditional privileges. From time to time, royal attempts at centralization provoked civil wars, which forced monarchs to issue promises, even formal guarantees, like England's Magna Carta of 1215, that they would in future respect the rights of their leading subjects. It was the constitutional victories of the barons that led kings in the 13th century to call into being assemblies of their non-noble subjects as a counterbalancing force. But in the parliaments, as they were called in England and Scotland, the different status of the two groups was clearly recognized. The nobles, summoned as individuals, formed one chamber. Elected knights, together with representatives of the towns, another. This was the beginning of the two-tier parliamentary system which would later spread far beyond Europe. All these developments were accompanied by, and indeed depended upon, a massive extension of written records. One of the most famous was the Register of Land and Property Holding in England, known as the Domesday Book, compiled in 1086. More documents quickly followed, administered by a growing company of literate laymen, many of whom had attended one of the institutions of higher learning, universities, which emerged in the 12th and 13th century in several parts of Europe, such as Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. By the end of the 13th century, therefore, Western Europe had developed a unique culture, a colonialist economy, and a distinctive form of state organization. Each was the result of a fusion of East and West, of Greek, Latin, and Arab influences. But one element was purely European, the power and influence of the Church, and it was in the great cathedrals, like this one at Lincoln, that the culture of medieval Europe found its most sublime expression. But these developments as yet remained confined to Europe. The crusading states mostly crumbled within a century. The attempts to transplant the Western system to the Baltic lands and the East European and Hungarian plains proved to be a slow and painful process. Before long, most of them collapsed under the impact of a new and terrible attack from Central Asia, the Mongol onslaught, which all but swept away Christian Europe as well.